breaking news today. Since the beginning of human history, people have employed weapons as a people need to produce and make this tool because it is one of the most important tools they can use for self-defense. However, in addition to the fact that it is of such great significance, it is also a tool that needs to be safeguarded. In days gone by, people were always looking for something better, a location to keep the weapons that they had crafted. But these days, each state has its own ammunition depot where it stores the newly manufactured. When crucial circumstances arise, such as when they are at war, for instance, the weapons that they have stored in these warehouses play an important part because a state is dependent on its ammunition. In times of conflict, ammunition depots can be seen as symbols of power and confidence. On the other hand, the destruction of ammunition depots would result in unexpected, in light of the fact that this will result in the destruction of the components upon which the state and the army depend. Let us now examine the situation regarding the ammunition and the depots in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Since the beginning of the conflict, the Russian army has been struggling with a significant lack of coordination. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian army has been growing stronger and stronger in response to the problems that the Russian army has been, which has resulted in the Russian army suffering enormous losses, even if they wanted to. The Russian military simply does not have the resources to launch an offensive against the well-planned and effective operations of the Ukrainian military. As a result of there being no ammunition available in the areas where the fighting is taking place, the Russian soldiers have no choice but to flee the battle. The Russian soldiers are in a very difficult situation as a result of the uneven distribution of ammunition across the fronts. Despite the fact that Southerns have an abundance of weapons and ammunition, stock soldiers on some fronts are still being killed because there is not enough ammunition. These issues have been made worse by the fact that the Ukrainian army has resisted without surrendering since the beginning of as well as by the fact that the war has lasted significantly longer than the Russian government had anticipated it would. Russia was able to find a solution to these issues, but unfortunately, that solution did not hold up for very long. The Russian army began to use the industrial warehouses it occupied in Ukraine as ammunition depots. Additionally, the Russian army transported ammunition to these depots without informing the Ukrainian army of its location. Russia believed that it had resolved the issue with the ammunition after coming up with this solution. However, Ukrainian intelligence was keeping a close eye on virtually every move Russia made. The Russian army kept its ammunition in a number of industrial depots, and the Ukrainian army was fully aware of all of these depots. Not only the Ukrainian intelligence services, but also the drones that are constantly being flown by the Ukrainian were able to pinpoint the precise locations of these storage facilities. The Ukrainian army made the decision to pursue a different course of action with regard to these ammunition depots and did not launch an assault on the depots directly. The Russian occupants' equipment was taken by the Ukrainian army after they organized raids in the areas where the warehouses were located. These raids were carried out at times when the Russian army was cut off, and the Ukrainian army used these raids to seize the equipment. These storage facilities held a significant quantity of armored vehicles, firearms, ammunition, and missiles. The Ukrainian military decided against detonating these rounds of ammunition in favor of seizing them. Instead, a significant quantity of the ammunition that was held by the Russian invaders made its way into the hands of the Ukrainian. In a similar fashion, the Ukrainian army took control of the ammunition depot that had been handed over to Russian occupiers before they fled the region, following the events that took place in the Castle region. This plan devised by Russia also proved unsuccessful as a result of the strength of the Ukrainian military and the strategic pathways that were. After exhausting all other options, Russia moved the ammunition depot to different regions in the middle of the night as a last-ditch effort. The senior commanders were the only ones who knew where the depots were located, and Russia surrounded the depots with a large number of mines. However, we are unable to say that this strategy was particularly successful. The things that Russia failed to take into account while making these plans led to the country's suffering enormous loss. When mines exploded around the Russian army's secret ammunition depot in the Arizo region, Russian soldiers traveled to the area and were shocked. The Russian army's secret ammunition depot was located in the Arizo region. There is no information regarding how approximately 200 Cheshire soldiers discovered the location of the ammunition depot in which the Russian soldiers were stationed, even though they were attempting to seize them. These CHA soldiers, it is asserted, had already joined the Ukrainian army and were responsible for the capture of a significant quantity of ammunition from Russian troops. If what is being said is accurate, then a significant portion of the ammunition that belonged to the Russian army is once again under the command of the Ukrainian army. As a result of all of these developments, Russia and the Russian army are heading toward a major crisis according to a further Alleg. Kadyrov is said to have divulged the location of the warehouse to Tekka soldiers. This is allegedly due to the fact that Kadyrov worked closely with the most senior military commanders. Chacha soldiers were the ones who were tasked with this mission by Kadyrov, has provided some statements in response to these events. According to the statements made by Kadyrov, Cha's soldiers had stumbled upon a hidden warehouse by complete and utter chance, and the weapons that were stolen from the warehouse were going to be given to Russian troops. Novin believed Kadyrov's statements because these events brought about a significant amount of chaos. A big clash took place in the region, and many Russian soldiers lost their lives as a result of this clash. Immediately after this, the Russian soldiers entered the region and noticed the Chechen soldiers at the big clash, which took place in the region. After the battle was over, the Chechen soldiers gathered all of the ammunition they had found in the warehouse into a vehicle, and then they drove away from the scene. Nobody is aware of what became of these soldiers. Already there are a significant number of additional activities taking place between churches and Russia. Things got a lot more complicated when Chechens joined the Russian army and started fighting alongside Russia against the Chechens, who had been engaged in a protracted war against Russia for their independence, because the churches had the intention of carrying on with the War of Independence. But Kadyrov, who was working with Putin, was making an effort to stop this from happening, because the majority of Chechen soldiers were opposed to Kady and Putin's ideas. This situation caused churches to fight against Russia and Ukrainian troops. The Russian army continued to suffer heavy casualties at the hands of Chechen fighters who were engaged in combat with Russia and the Ukrainian army. The current predicament facing the Russian army is one of the gravest. A significant number of Russian journalists are of the opinion that churches and soldiers ought to be expelled from the army due to the fact that this was not the only issue that was previously caused by Chechen soldiers. Chacha, a Russian ammunition depot, had been detonated by soldiers in the Karel region, and if this kind of thing keeps happening, there will be a great deal of disarray in the Russian army. On the other hand, there is no way for the Putin administration to kick Sicha soldiers out of because the Russian army will be forced to withdraw from the conflict. If Chechen soldiers are expelled from the military, there is a severe lack of soldiers in the Russian army, and it would appear that they could benefit from the addition of Chechen soldiers after the war. The majority of the church's soldiers continued their struggle using the guerrilla method, and the conflicts between churches and Russia, which continued their work using this method, lasted until 2000. The war between the Chechens and Russia lasted until 2009. In the year 2070, these conflicts resulted in the deaths of thousands of Russian soldiers, putting out support for Kadyrov to prevent the continuation of these conflicts. Kadyrov had church members and soldiers fighting for independence arrested in order to prevent them from continuing this. Did this in order to prevent them from continuing this conflict. The partnership between Putin and Korderos Corporation meant that Russia had the potential to also dominate this region. The judge and the people on the other end demonstrate the significant struggle that is being put forth to reject this circumstance. Putin has a significant amount of concern regarding the possibility that the judges and soldiers will choose to carry on with the independence war at any. Even if the situation in Ukraine warrants it, it appears that Russia is facing significant challenges in the name of independence and freedom. There have been numerous uprisings in the regions of Chechnya and Bashkortostan. It is only a matter of time before these regions engage Russia in a struggle for their independence. A conflict with Russia is inevitable. The Russian Federation is made up of 22 different republics, and if they lose the war, Russia may be on the verge of disintegrating into its constituent parts. Putin, who apparently has no idea what to do in response to these developments, invaded Ukraine with the expectation that he would be able to extend Russia's borders as a result, because the Russian government has not issued a statement in response to these. Even reliable information is being disseminated at an alarmingly rapid rate. There is still a lack of conclusive evidence regarding the reasons why the church and the soldiers took possession of the ammunition. So tell me, what are your thoughts on the recent events? In what ways do you believe the church and the military, their respective communities? What are your thoughts on the regions that are striving to achieve independence in opposition to? Do not overlook the opportunity to share your thoughts and opinions in the comments section. You can help us out by becoming a subscriber. According to historians, Genghis Khan did not drag out any of the wars he participated in, and as a result, he did not end up losing any of them. If Russian leader of Vladimir Putin had devised a strategy that wouldn't last but long, or had never entered this war in his, Genghis Khan might not have been drawn into a conflict that would end in defeat, which have carried on with the same level of intimidation. Vladimir Putin will not emerge victorious from this never-ending conflict in Ukraine, and he is on the verge of destroying his reputation. 1 year ago, at the direction of the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, a column of tanks advancing toward Kiev covered a distance of 40. The conquest of Ukraine in a matter of days was on the agenda, but Putin instead demonstrated the inadequacies of his own military. Ukraine is stepping up its its efforts to regain control of Crimea, which Putin has illegally occupied for almost a decade. Rather than being a further manifestation of Russian imperialism, this spore may represent a dramatic reversal of this ambition's course of. In March 2022, compromises on Crimea were on the table for discussion, provided that the Ukrainian president would organize Zelensky that the war would end and that they would save their city from destruction. Zelensky, on the other hand, declared in January of this year at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, that Crimea was our land, our territory, and he asked the West for weapons to retake the strategically important P. The Ukrainian president is encouraged to pursue military victories rather than any kind of negotiated solution whenever there is success on the battlefield. The fact that Russia routinely uses bases in Crimea to attack infrastructure in Ukraine only serves to bolster Kiev's conviction that retaking Crimea was necessary in order to put an end to the threat posed by Russia once, and Kiev frequently reaffirmed its unwavering commitment to its position regarding Crimea. By ordering attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces, it would appear that a positive custom is being established. It is, without a doubt, a custom of the Kiev military units to organize explosions once a week at the military airfield or in the territory of the Russian Federation located in. By putting on a show of force in the skies above Crimea, unmanned aerial vehicles that belong to Ukraine were successful in putting Vladimir Putin on edge. The most recent of these attacks took place in the region of the old air base in Garding-Bisky in Crimea, which is temporarily being controlled by Russia. A mysterious Ukrainian weapon blew up the military air base in Crimea the day after it which was approximately 240 kilometers away from the front line held by Russia. Residents of the area reported hearing and seeing explosions once again in the temporarily occupied portion of Crimea. This time, the explosions were reported to have occurred in the vicinity of a military air base in the urban-type village of Garbisky in the Sip district. The first thing that was reported was the sound of several explosions followed by the appearance of thick black. The photos or videos taken at the Bold Air Base, in addition to any other information gathered at the scene, have not yet been made. Public attacks carried out by unknown vehicles in Ukraine have inflicted another irreparable wound upon the military air bases located in the nearby village of Irki. There's a good chance that the heroic attackers behind this mission were actually bomb-laden drone. Huge explosions took place as the bombs were dropped from drones onto the military air base. At that moment, the skies over Crimea gave themselves over to the authority of the Russians in black clothes. Regarding the attack, we have not yet issued a statement. On the other hand, taking into account the ammunition and personnel at the airbase, there is a significant chance that there will be significant casualties. This week in Crimea, in addition to the attacks on the guard discs, there were several days that were very active. A recent explosion took place close to the military unit held by Russian invaders in Sarai, which is located in Crimea. Explosions could be heard in Yalta, as well as in other settlements located along the southern coast of the peninsula that are controlled by the Russian. The assault carried out by the drone resulted in the destruction of the unit located on SIOP Street in Bakhtrusara. The force of the explosion was so great that the terrifying sound of subsequent explosions could be heard in a number of different villages across Bakhtrusara. In addition, the explosions were so powerful that people were injured even on the northern side of Sevastopol, where back in Sarai, the engineering warehouse of the military unit or the 758 Logistics Center was located. This location is approximately 25 kilometers away from Sarai. The 22nd Army or Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation was one of the armed forces that took part in the Russian invasion of. The Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation also housed the warehouse for the 133rd Brigade of the main task organization of the Russian Federation Black Sea Fleet. The 133rd Brigade is in charge of providing the Corps unit with its supplies and handling its logistics. Yalta was rocked by explosions not long after the ones that took place in Bakhtrusara in the vicinity of 8 p.m. Residents of Yalta reported hearing a loud. The other day, residents of Yalta complained that their furniture and the glass in their windows were shaking. They also reported that the windows themselves were shaking. The sound was so loud that it set off the alarms in cars that were parked in Yalta close to the horses. The residents of the city were frightened, not only by the sound of the explosion, but also by the sound of the planes taking off. At the same time, both Yalta and Burzlav had a lot of background noise to deal. In addition, Ukrainian drones were responsible for a series of explosions that took place in the city of Gozo. Specific information is provided. As of yet, no information regarding the explosion has been disclosed. The success of Ukrainian drones was demonstrated by explosions in Guardian strongholds in Quebec, Syria, Yalta, and Go. The leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, has maintained a relative silence in the face of Ukraine's successes in its attacks. It would appear that Ukraine is intent on acquiring control of Crimea. Do you believe Ukraine can successfully take control of Crimea? Let's have a more in-depth discussion about the possibility, shall we? An analyst from Ukraine stated that there were convincing conversations held among government officials in Kiev are planning to launch an operation to retake Crimea even before the Donbas region, which is where the majority of the fighting is taking place at the moment, has been completely secured, according to Elena Furlova, vice president of the Center for Defense Strategies in Kiev and a former deputy defense minister of Ukraine. In the past few months, the political and military elites of Ukraine have increased their signal that they have clear goals for the rehabilitation of crime. This was stated by Elena Furlova. In addition, she mentioned the government's investigation was backed by various departments within the Biden administration. In the past, Ukraine's Western allies were of the opinion that Crimea was part of Ukraine's region. Yes, you are correct. On the other hand, it's possible that another answer awaits us. They were more interested in negotiating over Donbas than they were about crime. But these kinds of things are no longer being said. It is currently believed that if we are successful in retaking Crimea, there will be a significant shift in both the front line and the political process. On the other hand, it will make accessing the eastern areas much easier. One of the most outspoken advocates for this concept was General Ben Holtz, who had previously served as commander of the United States Army in. According to Hooch, the defining region is the Crimea Peninsula. This is the main consideration. Everything will fall into place after the liberation of Crimea by Ukraine, which I believe is still possible. This year, the Crimea was at the bottom of the hierarchy in the war plans. It was the final item on the list to be resolved and was possibly even masked as an offer of peace too. However, in the most recent few months, it has been on the agenda of the government of the United States, either this summer as a potential means of ending the war and relieving Russia of the burden of attrition brought on by the conflict. There is a widespread fear in Washington that if there is no clear end in sight to the conflict in Ukraine, it will be difficult to keep the support of the American people for the Ukrainian. These are arguments both for and against the West, support for Ukrainian mission in Crimea, and it is still unclear which direction the United States will finally turn. However, the Biden administration has reported that it has become more flexible. Pence and I took the option while we were playing a war game. According to experts on the plan called for isolating Crimea as a first step and then launching a combined force operation to retake the region. Once Russian troops were established in the beginning stages of such an operation, the Ukraine would require long-range attack capabilities like the Adia CMS, the provision of other equipment, in addition to a surface-to-surface missile with a range of 190 miles to the west will be required in order for the Ukrainians to be able to deploy a large armor that is able to penetrate animal lungs and is not susceptible to being blown up by mines or getting stuck in trenches dug by the Russians. Assuming that such an offensive went according to plan, and that the Russian supply lines were severed, the Ukrainians then launched a combined force attack on all of the Russian troops that were still present in the Crimea with the intention of defeating them in close-range combat and forcing them to retreat. While there are professionals who are confident that this strategy will be success, there are also those who have significant doubts. Although it is true that the Ukrainians have repeatedly shown themselves to be formidable fighters and have already hit various Russian facilities in the Crimea, it is quite another thing to enter attack and hold such a heavily fortified area that is protected by the Russian naval fleet. Although it is true that the Ukrainians want to isolate the Crimea, it is quite another thing to enter attack and hold such a heavily fortified area that is protected by the Russian naval fleet. In addition, there is no agreement among Western nations concerning the delivery of weapons with a greater range to Ukraine. Few people have faith that Russia will launch a nuclear strike on a tactical level, but many people are concerned about this possibility. Any weapon that could be potentially used by Ukraine to launch an attack inside Russia's territory could increase the risk of escalation, which could in turn plunge other Western countries into a direct war with Russia. In a nutshell, the incontestable truth is that Russia's occupation of Crimea ought to be made to bear a great deal more financial. We will hold off on making any judgments until we can determine what impact the annexation of Crimea and control over the Black Sea will have on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Please make sure to subscribe to our channel and give the videos you watch a thumbs up. We appreciate you keeping an eye on us. You can show your support for us by subscribing to our newsletter, The Military Intervention That Russia Conducted In, which shook the foundations of the European security architecture, mobilized the EU and its member states in the field of security and defense, which is the most important of the regions. The regions surrounding the Baltic Sea and the Baltic Sea itself were the ones that felt the multifaceted effects of the war the most. Now, let's take a look at the enormous impact that the war between Ukraine and Russia has had on the Baltics, the new face of the changing world's geopolitical, the Game of Thrones and the geography of the Baltics, Sweden's cooperation with Ukraine, and especially the bold moves of the Swedish Navy against Russia. When we do this, we will notice that especially Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden have taken very serious measures in response to the conflict, combating the Russian Navy and Russian aggression in the Baltic region. We can see that the Baltic trio is keeping a close eye on St. Petersburg and its environs at the same time that these countries are working to maintain control over Kaliningrad and its environs. We have recently seen B-50-2s flying over the Baltic Sea and putting on a show of strength for their audience. One of the countries that has taken additional measures to protect itself from the danger posed by Russia in the Baltic region is Sweden. The Russian Navy is Sweden's primary concern because Sweden possesses the most strategically significant island in the Baltic Sea. When viewed in this light, it is clear that the Swedish army is exerting maximum effort in its conflict with Russia. The Swedish government has designed and built submarines with the express purpose of countering the Russian Navy, and it has also developed specialized fighter jets to take on the Russian air. In the past month, Sweden has put all of its armed forces on high alert and taken direct action to obstruct the Russian Navy in the Baltics, as well as to reduce the severity of the threats. The resumption of hostilities on the European continent revived NATO's original mission, which had been called into question during the period following the end of the Cold War era. And while we can now say that it has led to a better understanding of its value as the primary actor responsible for the defense of, we are now back to the times when the mentality of the Second World War and the threat posed by the Soviet Union were once again felt. You can see that it is currently following a path that is further removed from the impulsive movements that occurred during the time of the Cold War or during the Second World War. However, Hitler's invasion would have progressed much more difficult and more quickly if he had been able to invade Ukraine as quickly as Putin. It is very possible that he will threaten countries in Eastern Europe and even countries in Scandinavia with an attack policy that is comparable to the one he has used in the past. We can see that these countries' perceptions of the conflict in Ukraine have recently shifted, and they have recently made an offer of support to Ukraine that has the potential to alter the course of the conflict. Let's take a closer look at the movie that this situation has forced us all to observe. As a result of Russia's intervention in Ukraine, countries that have traditionally adhered to a policy of military neutrality have been forced to reevaluate their stances in light of shifting threat perceptions because of their decisions. Sweden, which had fought the Soviet Union twice during the Second World War, had to follow a strict policy of neutrality in order to maintain its territorial integrity and independence, and had not even participated in any war for the previous 200. Applied to become a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. When we consider the past, we can see that Sweden made some efforts toward enhancing its cooperation with NATO. Following the conclusion of the Cold War, Sweden actively contributed to various NATO missions and operations across a variety of geographical areas, in addition to taking part in a number of NATO drills on a consistent basis as part of the Partnership for Peace program. The decision of the Scandinavian country, which is a member of the EU, to follow a policy of military non-alignment with the radical change in the European security architecture as a result of Russia's intervention in Ukraine was influenced in a decisive way by factors such as the concern about the possible reaction of Russia and the public's disapproval of NATO membership. These factors played a key role in the country's decision to follow a policy of military non-alignment. It is clear that these considerations no longer hold any weight for Sweden. The Swedish government has made the decision to beef up the military's preventative measures in response to Russia's activities. The geopolitical earthquake that was caused by the war in Russia and Ukraine was the deciding factor in the significant increase in support for NATO membership among the Swedish public, and it prompted Stockholm to reconsider its policies regarding national. In point of fact, the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO is a development that constitutes a change that is reshaping the geopolitics of Northern Europe, with the accession of Finland being the most significant of the two, which already shares a land border of 1,340 kilometers with Russia. The length of the NATO border with Russia will almost double. In addition to the accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO will bring all 5 of the Nordic countries under its protection, thereby bridging the strategic void that had previously existed on the northern flank of the alliance as a result of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. The previously existing strategic void in the organization's northern flank has been filled, and all 5 of the Nordic countries now fall under the protection of the organization's umbrella. The entry of these 2 will bring about prosperous and democratic nations that join NATO with troops that are both agile and modern will make a significant contribution to the defense and deterrence of the Baltic region, as well as the northern flank of the alliance. Furthermore, it is believed that this move will strengthen NATO's hand in the Arctic region, which is shaping up to be a new geopolitical competition area for Finland, and the most significant advantage of becoming a member of NATO will be the opportunity to take advantage of the security umbrella provided by the Atlantic Alliance, specifically Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which calls for a coordinated defense effort. According to information that was made public by the Swedish Ministry of Defense, the Swedish armed forces have increased their presence along the country's southern coast and at sea, including on Sweden's Scotland Island. This decision was made after Sweden recently discovered that a number of Russian Northern Navy landing craft had entered the Baltic Sea. As a result, Sweden decided to reposition its troops in response to this development. In a nutshell, Sweden is improving its position because of its strategic location along the Baltic Sea by amassing troops in close proximity to Ukraine. Moscow has denied the existence of such plans, leading to speculation that it may be rethinking its decision to invade, and has stated that it has the ability to station forces anywhere it pleases on its own territory. The island of Gotland, which is the largest in Sweden, is strategically significant and is located approximately 330 kilometers from Kaliningrad, which is the headquarters of Russia's Baltic Fleet. Despite the fact that Sweden is not a member of, the country maintains strong ties to the Atlantic Alliance and is currently working to bolster its armed forces after decades of neglect in response to rising concerns regarding Russian military maneuvers in the Baltic region, the local area, after several years of steadily deteriorating security conditions, including in Sweden's immediate geographical environment, which were brought on by the presence of Russian landing craft in the Baltic Sea. Sweden has decided to move GOT. In the past few weeks, Swedish warships from the 3rd and 4th Naval Fleets have been sailing more frequently than usual off the southern coast of Sweden in order to gather intelligence and demonstrate their presence. This is in response to increased Russian activity in the region. It is common knowledge that a number of Russian warships have transited the Baltic Sea in the most recent weeks. In addition to deploying ships the Swedish armed forces deployed land-based coastal defense systems in southern Sweden. It is possible that this was done in order to counteract the presence of Russia's fleet in the Black Sea. They additionally come with RBS-15 anti-ship missiles in their arsenal. Even though some of the equipment was salvaged from decommissioned coastal defense systems, the vast majority of it was upgraded and made relevant to the current environment. These defense systems were first brought back into service with the armed forces in 2016, and the Navy is now operating with them in their entirety. The defense system unit has been a part of the military for several years, and during that time, it has become fully organizationally and tactically integrated into the 3rd Naval Squadron. In addition, the Royal Swedish Navy, which has its headquarters in Karl, has recently commissioned a fleet of 5 diesel-electric submarines to add to its submarine force. The Swedish Navy views its submarines as an essential component of the country's overall defense system. Swedish submarines have recently expanded their capabilities after having been initially assigned to the Baltic Sea region to deter the possibility of an invasion by the Soviet. These ships started taking part in multinational rapid response exercises in areas of operations such as the North Sea, Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Bay of Biscay, and Mediterranean Sea. Reconnaissance, gathering intelligence, and surveillance are the 3 primary focuses of its new missions. On the other hand, Sweden has plans to create a brand new category of submarines called the Six. Due to the intensifying conflict on the seabed between Russia and Ukraine, the Swedish Navy has decided to increase its budget to allow for the purchase of a 3rd submarine. The Swedish Navy has expressed regret over how unprepared it was during what are believed to be Russian attacks on the Nord Stream pipeline, and is currently working to find a solution to this. As a result, the new A-26 submarines will be outfitted with the capability to detect and communicate with pipes located below the water surface. Sweden has emphasized that developments in Europe have been moving towards a serious policy crisis in Europe for some time, and that this has accelerated in recent months, issuing a warning if there is an illusion that tensions in Europe will be the primary objectives of Russia are to establish regime stability and to fortify its position as a major world power. The prevention of NATO expansion around Russia is Sweden's top priority, and this strategy appears to be one that will take a very long time to implement. On the other hand, Russia has also sent a more modern and larger type of LST from its northern fleet to the Baltic Sea. These ships are located in the Baltic. Even a dozen battle tanks, 40 amphibious armored personnel carriers, 300 soldiers, and a squad of attack helicopters are all within its carrying capacity. With the addition of these additional offensive capabilities, Russia's military presence in the Baltic region has reached a point of critical mass. Magdalena Andersson, who had only been appointed to her position as Prime Minister of Sweden in November, was put through an early test by the CDU. Since the beginning, Anderson has been tasked with rebutting Russia's assertions that NATO should place restrictions on its expansion plans. After meeting with Finnish President Sally in early January, Ernesto Anderson declared that all states have the right to freely choose their own security arrangements. Despite the fact that Sweden and its neighbor Finland have aligned their militaries with NATO, neither country is a full member of the 30 nation. After meeting with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO Anderson also made the announcement that Sweden would strengthen its partnership with the organization. These new developments are tipping the scales of the constantly shifting equilibrium policy in both directions at once. There have been many developments that appear to work in Russia's favor. The events of today could completely reverse their fortune. Tomorrow, taking into consideration the fact that Putin has endangered the very last lines of defense in Ukraine in the years to come, it is possible that we will find ourselves awakened to a completely new order for the world.